Sound on Sound has been in publication for 30 years, and during that time a lot has changed in the world of music production. We spoke to Editor-in-Chief Paul White and Technical Editor Hugh Robjohns about some of the major changes in the last 30 years, what they think has remained constant, and to get their thoughts for the future.
My first home studio was set up probably in the mid-70s. It's when the first Tascam 4-track open reel machine came out, the 3340 I think it was. I had an MM mixer and it hadn't got enough channels, so I actually copied the circuit board and built an extra 8 channels for it. Back then there were no commercial reverb units other than Springs. There was very little really, but my previous career was in electronics, so I built a lot of my own gear.
In '85 we hadn't, CDs were around, and we had the Sony F1 system, which I had actually. I had an audio design recording version of the Sony F1, which was called the 701. And I used to use that to record choirs and orchestras and things. And I was amazed by it because it was so light and portable. It was basically an adapter box and a Betamax video recorder. So really small and light, much lighter than the old Revox A77s and B77s that I was using before. And then the DAT machine, portable DATs and studio DATs, 16-bit 44 or 48K recorders. It had all the benefits of things like the Sony F1 system and the big professional 1610s, but in a very much smaller format. And you can actually have portable DAT recorders. So again, I was working in television at the time, and being able to go out and record location sound on a DAT tape and send that back instead of the old Nagras, the 1/4-inch Nagras, that made a big difference. But they were not the most reliable of things, to say the least. At that time, we were starting to get into digital mixers in post-production. And in television, you've got timecode to remember where you are in the program, and you've got a digital clock master to clock out the digits, and the two have to be synchronous. And there were no end of problems where situations were engineered where that didn't happen. And so you had all sorts of glitches and problems and operational issues. It was a difficult time, end of the 80s. Because I was working professionally at the BBC, I had access to studios there, so I didn't really need my own studio until I left the B, actually. So I really didn't set up my own place until 97, 98, something like that. But most of my work's always been recording on location, and then I took it into studios to post-produce and mix and so on.
Back in the 80s, when you started a home studio, you'd only got 4 tracks on your tape machine, and shortly afterwards, when 8 tracks became available, I bought one of those machines as well. But you had the cost of tape, you had a limited number of tracks, you had very few effects. The only compressors I got were homemade ones.
The first issue of SOS came out in 1985, only 2 years after MIDI was introduced. MIDI would prove to be one of the most important advances of the 1980s for music makers.
It was polyphonic, you could control multiple devices, and it was best of all, it was a standard adopted by all the major manufacturers. And that was no mean feat really, because prior to that none of them agreed on anything, not even the CV and gate standards. So MIDI actually allowed instruments from different manufacturers to talk to each other, and it really did make a difference. Everything came together. The sequencer appeared and actually made use of MIDI, so it was all Atari 1040s, that kind of thing. And of course, it changed the world.
Throughout the 80s, digitisation of audio itself became more and more important to those working in all areas of the music industry. The technology brought with it great convenience, but some issues for early adopters.
The early digital stuff was very small, it was compact, it was light, compared to the big analog tape machines that we used to have to lug about. And the quality was fantastic because whatever sound you put in, you pretty much got exactly the same back. And that wasn't the case with analog. And then against that, there was a kind of a brittleness to the sound because those early filters were really kind of stretching the technology. So they could sound a bit hard and brittle if you pushed it a little bit too far. And the other issue was that with levels, if you overcooked it, it did sound horrible. And if you didn't drive hard enough, you could get a kind of granular quantize distortion effect. So they weren't perfect, but they were a step forward. Yeah, so moving through towards the end of the 80s, that was when the digital world was really beginning to pick up. We had the very first digital audio workstations, which were incredibly crude by modern standards, but revolutionary for us at the time. AMS brought out a thing called the audiophile, which was, at that time, it was an 8-track hard disk recorder editor. And it revolutionized post-production, television post-production. Before that, we were using multi-track tape, 1-inch 8 tracks and that kind of thing. But this was so much faster. You could do so much more precise edits. It was a phenomenal thing. We also had recordable CDs. That made a big change to things because we could burn a CD and give it to people to take home and listen. And CDs were relatively new and exciting at that time.
The next development for me was the introduction of digital recording, and the first system I had was something called Sound Tools from a company called DigiDesign, which no one had ever heard of. And this thing worked on a little black and white Mac with a sort of 9-inch screen. And it was essentially a 2-track recorder with some editing features. And I think my first hard drive, which I bought to go with that, which was 600 megabytes, not gigabytes, megabytes, I managed to get a trade deal for only £2,500 instead of the £4,500 it was supposed to cost. And in fact, I went to PC World the other day and bought myself a little 4 terabyte backup drive and calculated that if I'd bought that back in 1985 or 86, it would probably cost me over £10 million. Now, the reason I got it was so that I could put together albums for people, do a bit of mastering. Because back then mastering was quite often about compiling, which was putting the analog tracks in order, a little bit of EQ balancing, level balancing. So I did quite a few albums for people like Fairport Convention and Gordon Giltrap. And that almost paid for that first hard drive, I think, which is still in my cellar somewhere in the cupboard of eternal darkness, along with other bits of unused gear.
Affordable tape-based digital recording practically rose and fell within the space of a decade, but digital audio continued to evolve throughout the 90s, with DAWs becoming more established.
By the time we got into the 90s, we had Pro Tools was pretty well established. Sonic Solutions was another DAW editing system. And again, my background in broadcasting, SADI became very, very big, in particularly in radio.
I think the big thing for everyone was the advent of the DAW, DAW, as opposed to the thing you get in and out of the studio with. They were closely followed by samplers which you could run on your computer once enough memory was available. And at that point, it became obvious that audio would soon follow as soon as hard disk prices became low enough and capacity became high enough.
SADI was, I think, launched in '91, and it was a very cost-effective DAW that ran on a PC. And it was geared up to be usable in the way that suited radio particularly well. So editing on it, audio editing, was just a joy. And you could do stuff that you could never do with razor blades and 1/4-inch tape. And it was faster, and it introduced the idea that nothing was fixed anymore. If you messed up an edit, you could unpick it and go back to where you were, which was not that easy to do with tape often, especially if you were cutting out slithers and they ended up on the floor. So that was quite an interesting time. And we also had things like the first modular digital multitracks, the ADAT machines, which were 8 tracks on SVHS tape, Tascam with the DA88, which used high-8 videotapes. And they were basically just glorified video machines, but designed to record audio. But in this sort of 8-channel modular format, that became very popular. So you could start with one machine, 8 tracks, and then add 2 for 16 and 3 for 24. And that became a very, very popular approach. I suppose that whole digital tape thing with DAT tapes as well, that ran through most of the early 90s, right through until probably about 95. And after that, we started getting hard disk recorders. And the world changed then. We had things like the Alesis HD24, a lot of big DAWs now from people like Steinberg and from eMagic and people like that turned into Logic. And the world moved to really embrace DAWs as the way forward, and all these hardware-based recorders started to fade away, really.
DAWs took a leap forward with the introduction of the VST standard, which opened up a world of in-the-box processing options.
Steinberg introduced their VST plugins in the mid-90s, and that started to give you some really powerful signal processing tools that you could do inside the computer. So it all just happened on a screen in front of you, and it was so much faster and flexible than anything we had before.
The VST format was particularly interesting because it allowed third-party manufacturers to design effects plugins that would work in their sequencer, and they were far-sighted enough to make the thing wider, offer it to other people. So it was a kind of standardization in the same way that MIDI was.
For me particularly, I think the invention of digital audio restoration tools was a really big change in what we could do in audio. So Cedar started producing the dehissers and declickers and those kind of things starting around 91. It was products that came out of work they did with the National Sound Archive, actually. And that was just amazing. You could have these crackly old records and produce almost pristine audio from the end of it with very, very few artifacts. And then the dehissers that were able to save things. And then we moved on to things like Retouch, which was the first of the spectral audio editors. And that's completely revolutionized what you can do to fix problems in sound and to tidy things up. And the fact that we now have the capability in a digital format to record audio which far exceeds our own capabilities of hearing sound. So we can record to higher frequencies, we can record to quieter noise floors, greater dynamic ranges. Back in the analog days, that was always a struggle. And I think as a professional, you always need a format that has greater bandwidth and a better dynamic range performance than the product you're finally trying to deliver. And that was difficult in the analog days. With digits, it's so much easier. So you've got room to play.
Instruments also followed outboard processors into the mysterious land of the box, though as usual, it took a while for things to run smoothly.
I remember Martin Walker, who was our PC columnist, getting very excited about software instruments for the PC. And of course, at that time, the computers weren't really fast enough to handle it, so everything was beset with latency problems and running out of processing power. And I think he got excited about it probably a year or two before he should have. But of course, computing power follows Moore's law, more or less. We get more and more of it for less and less money. And before long, it actually started to work properly.
Moving up to the present day, it seems that many rebel against digitisation by fetishising analogue gear. Is this a noble pursuit, or do we see old equipment through rose-tinted glasses?
It's a good phrase, that, isn't it? Fetishisation of analogue. It's certainly there. There's a lot of people that are very keen, and I think part of it's a backlash against the ease and convenience of digital stuff. You have to think more about using analog. It takes longer. It's a more laboured process, and in some way, I think that can become more rewarding. Funnily enough, I like analog. I've got 2 analog tape machines at home. I've got an expensive record player at home. I still like all that stuff, and I still enjoy it, and it's still very rewarding. Would I want to carry my Studer 807 into a location recording situation? Absolutely not. No way. But do I like transferring stuff onto it and playing it back? Yeah, of course I do. It's lovely. And I've even done some edits on it occasionally. It won't go away. There are people that will spend mad amounts of money on analog just because they can. And there will be people who will buy stuff because it's been recorded on analog equipment. I don't miss the days of having to work with analog. I much prefer working with digits. It's better quality, it's easier, it's more convenient, and you can do more with it. But analog won't go away.
Some of it is very, very good, like the old Neve preamps and equalizers. But analog tape, I'm not so sure about that. I mean, it does have a certain magic, much of which can be replicated via software plugins. But it had so many downsides when you were actually using it. So I was kind of glad to see the back of it, because at least with digital gear, what you put in is very close to what comes out. With tape, it wasn't. You had to second guess what the tape was going to do to it all the time. So I think analog does have something to offer, but you shouldn't immediately assume that everything analog is better than everything digital, because it's not the case.
There's definitely a move with DAWs and with the plug-in market, big as it is, and the improvements in modelling and synthesis of classic equipment. You can do a lot of stuff inside the box now, and a lot of people will, obviously, and there are benefits to that because of the automation. You can call up a project from 6 months ago and all of the effects are built in exactly as you left them. That's fantastic. But at the moment anyway, there are still some aspects of those kind of signal processing systems that don't quite sound right, and analog hardware in some cases still has an edge, particularly I think with things like compression, EQ to an extent, certainly compression. So I think hardware stuff will persist to meet that demand. The issue is, can it be made more convenient than it currently is? And I think we're on the cusp now in 2015 of that becoming something that is likely to happen. We're starting to see now 500 series modules, for example, and 19-inch rack modules that can be remote controlled. They have a USB connection to the computer. You can have a VST plug-in that will remote control them. So all the parameters can be stored in your DAW project, but it actually uses external hardware. So you run signals out through your interface into the hardware and back again, but you control it from the computer. And there's an awful lot of that beginning to start to appear now. And I think that's going to become a much bigger thing. People will like to use classic analog processors, but with all the convenience and integration of DAW workflows. I think that could be a big thing.
There does still seem to be an obsession with equipment to the detriment of looking at the source. I mean, the source of the music you're recording is the most important thing, which means a well-rehearsed guy or a girl playing a well-rehearsed song, arranged properly. But once you've got all that, you need to be doing it in a sympathetic environment, that is acoustically. And sometimes, in other ways, you might want subdued lighting to get the best out of a performance. But a lot of people seem to skip that and they go straight on to, let's just stick a mic in the bedroom, get someone there singing to it. And I think probably 90% of a good recording happens before the sound ever gets to that microphone. So we have to pay a lot more attention to acoustics, which can be improvised quite easily. The magazine explains lots of ways of doing it for very little or no money. And that makes more difference than spending, $2,000 on a very fancy preamplifier. Because if you haven't treated your acoustics, you're going to end up with just a more accurate recording of a very bad room. And you can't get rid of a boxy, amateurish room sound by layering effects on top of it. It just doesn't work. So paying attention to the sound source and the environment in which it's recorded, I think, is the most important thing.
I suppose for me, I'm technical editor. I like the technical stuff, and for me, the equipment is nice and it's interesting and exciting and it develops and it brings new opportunities. But the thing that persists through all of it is that the techniques stay pretty much the same. I mean, I still work in the same way, more or less, now that I did in the 80s. The actual mechanics of doing something might change slightly, but the technique, fundamental underlying technique, is still the same. So I still place microphones in the same way. I still pan things in the same way. Back in the 80s when I was recording, I'd record through a mixing console and I'd ride the fader going into tape to control dynamic range before it got to a compressor. Today I tend to do it with automation in the DAW, but it's effectively doing the same thing and for the same reasons. That's the important thing. So techniques persist. You can add new techniques as we go along, as new technologies become available, but those underlying skills and underpinning ideas are still there, and I think they probably always will be.
The thing about modern music technology is that it's now got very affordable, and that is again because of the DAW running on an affordable computer. When you have things like GarageBand, which cost almost no money, and if George Martin had had that back in the day of the Beatles, they would have done wonderful things with it. The technology no longer is the limiting element in making a good record, I don't think. It's almost a commodity. It costs very little. It's down to talent, it's down to the room, it's down to the mics, knowing where to put them, it's down to the performance, but the gear itself, you could almost pick any system and get good results from it.
I think access to those kind of tools is fantastic. When I first got into audio recording, it was with quarter-inch tape and cassette tapes and that kind of thing. And the quality was really limited, and you ran into problems. We used to do, the Sound on Sound magazine's title, where you dub from one machine to another or you copy from one track to another. And quality deteriorated really, really quickly with that kind of technology. And it was very frustrating. And now you have access to things like GarageBand on an iPad, and you've got a full studio's worth of equipment that costs next to nothing and works superbly well. It's phenomenal. It's a fantastic thing. The downside, I suppose, is that it makes it possible for everybody to turn out material, whether it's worth turning out or not. And there are pros and cons with that, obviously.
So anyone can have a go. It doesn't mean everyone's going to be good at it, but it means everyone who's got the potential to be good at it can afford to get hold of something that they can work with and get results. So it's a very, very good thing. I mean, back in the day, tape recorders were horrendously expensive. It was the price of several cars for a good 16 or 24-track tape recorder. And now you can go to the App Store and buy something for the price of a night out and a curry.
So what do our esteemed editors look forward to in the future for audio recording?
A lot of Sound on Sound's readers are guitar players, not keyboard players, and I'm one of those. So all these new ways of controlling instruments from guitar are very appealing. In fact, I've just been trying that app called, aptly enough, MIDI Guitar. It's about £30 to buy, and it takes a regular guitar, turns it into polyphonic MIDI, and it works pretty much as well as any of the hardware devices I've tried. So I'm quite excited by that, because that allows me to get into the world of interesting noises without having to get cramp in my fingers.
The idea of having just an audio editor or an audio production system will fade out, and it will have video in it as well. It will have facilities to post stuff directly online into websites and that kind of thing. I think it will become much more integrated. Back when DAWs first came out, Sonic Solutions was a very different thing to Pro Tools or to Sadie or to anything else. They had different facilities, they operated in different ways. Today, they're much, much more similar, and you can look at most DAWs and find your way around them now really quickly. The same thing happened back in the 60s with analog tape. You know, some of those early tape machines, the tape went from left to right, some of them went from right to left. Some of them had the oxide on the outside, some had the oxide on the inside. They were all awkward and incompatible and difficult, but very quickly they converged into a very common format. And you know, we got used to that very quickly. The same thing is happening with DAWs. Where it goes in the future, I think it's very hard to predict because it's now entirely dependent on the computer industry. You know, we used to have dedicated analog formats. We had quarter-inch tape, we had cassettes, we had vinyl LPs, we had CDs, and now we don't. Now we just have a file format that will play on any computer anywhere. So it's a bit hard to know exactly where it's going to go, I think. It depends on the computer industry and what they turn out. Looking back, when I started in the industry in the early 80s, when the magazine started in 85, when I joined it in 97, compared with today, it's so much better today. You can do so much more. You can do it more easily, more quickly. You can do it in a much more compact space. Where we'll be in another 10 years, I have no idea, but I'm really looking forward to it. It's exciting stuff.
If you like this video, subscribe to the Sound on Sound YouTube channel for all our latest video content. Also, you can find the magazine in your local newsagent, download the tablet edition, or find us online at soundonsound.com. Thanks for watching.